So I wrote down a bunch of thoughts that I'll
Excellent.
share in framing and stuff. So I've given some thoughts about it
Oh
yesterday.
man, if we get into Jira, that's gonna be so funny. Also, I think we're going live now, so perfect time to go live. Um, hey everybody, welcome to another Wardley Mapping Conversations. I'm joined today by the one, the only Tristan Slominski. We're also joined today by the one and only Barbara Frontera. Hi, Barbara.
Hey, Ben. How are you?
Welcome.
The one and only. There's actually quite a few of us.
Are there? Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
I spoke too
Very,
soon.
very popular name.
Well, the good news is the two of you are here, and we're live today to talk about something really interesting that Barbara said that caught my attention. And Tristan and the three of us it seems like this could be a very fruitful conversation. So you said something interesting. You said, if a company buys a product, that product becomes the way that they do the method that the product is embodying. And in this case, we were talking about mapping, and now now I'm thinking, oh my God, this reminds me so much of the Marshall McLuhan phrase, "The medium is the message," which is to say that the medium, like books, TV, radio, etc., and now like we've got social media and TikTok and all this fun stuff. That's the thing that's interesting to study because it designs what can be said. It designs what the message can be. And so I think there's this parallel here, and I'm going to attribute this phrase to Barbara now. The medium is the methodology. And
I usually just say the tool becomes the thing.
the tool becomes I like that too. Yeah, the tool becomes the thing, which is also how Twitter works. Don't be today's main character on Twitter is a good rule to follow. Excellent. So there are a couple reasons this is interesting. Like one, of course, is we've got all these tools out there in the wide world that we use. Tristan was talking about Jira as an example of that, where like even Scrum or Agile or what have you has been like boiled down into fields and tick boxes, and the tool has set what people learn about what these words and methods mean. And so that means there's a certain way that they don't get fully kind of explored, and it's a tough kind of thing just for methodology in general. And then the other reason it's interesting is because folks like Tristan, and I'm definitely interested in this as well, and I like all the different kind of stuff that's happening around this. Folks are building tools for Wardley mapping. And so the choices that folks like Tristan are making right now will actually like shape the way people learn mapping. And this is like not a bad thing. This is an amazing thing. And it's an exciting thing. And so like lots of like reasons to be interested in this topic in general. So first, maybe I'll Barbara, let's give you the floor. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've experienced around this phenomenon that makes you feel so strongly about it?
Well, let me begin by saying that I love tools. I use them all the time. Without my can opener, I'd be lost.
Fair enough.
So I'm not anti-tool in any way, shape, or form. And because I've worked for so long as a consultant and things like that, and I've gone into a lot of organizations, I've watched this develop where the way you do Agile, for example, is determined by the tool that your leadership bought to manage Agile.
Yeah.
And as a manager, when I was dropped into organizations to manage something, I often found that they were managing the tool and not the process.
Mm.
Or whatever it was that whatever outcome they were going for, we often were bogged down in managing the tool, and then of course there's all the delightful metrics that become associated with the tool. And Tristan, I really love Mapkeep, and I have to say I've been looking at it and it's great. But I see a day when they're like, Ben, your maps are not evolving at the same rate as the rest of the company.
How come you can't handle more than 12 components?
Right. Ben, Ben. Yeah. And so like I as I say, the Mapkeep is great. And one of the things, especially when it comes to Wardley mapping, is because there's the community, this is sort of community managed, right? And it's not going to evolve at the same rate across the community necessarily. Simon's off doing things, he's pretty hands off with some of the stuff, and so is that is that going to be one of those things that creates a greater and greater distance between how different people practice Wardley mapping? And if I think I know how to do Wardley mapping and I go into a company and they go, well, we use tool X, Y, and Z, and I don't know how to do that. And I've run into this with every sort of project management tool you can think of. I've been shunned because I didn't use Basecamp. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing, and I don't think that, given what human nature and late stage extractive capitalism is like, that it's something that can necessarily be avoided. But I do like to always be aware.
Yeah, so there's like a kind of codification of a methodology and this reminds me of like something you see anywhere, right? Whenever there's a process and someone says let's automate it or let's supplement it with technology, it's like if you haven't fully understood the process and the way that it needs to work on paper before it gets codified in some kind of code that gets committed and then is hard to change and so on, then like, do you really understand the process that you're codifying? And I think that's the same for the methodology side of this too. And Bernie in the chat mentions, first of all, that you are a multitude of Barbaras. Second of all, that the tool kind of can act as a governing constraint. It's a hard boundary about what behavior is and isn't allowed, because literally you cannot, like, there's not a degree of flexibility in like a text box, for example, versus a conversation.
Well, and it also can lead to a sort of delusional state, right? We have acquired Jira and thus we are agile. We have acquired Mapkeep and thus we Wardley map. And so there's, it is as you say, the codification is the codification is also a symptom of the stratification. Right? Because, on the ground, the team may want to use all of these tools in very sort of, flexible ways, or, come up with new ways of approaching work through the tool. But from us at, a couple of levels up, they're like, we got to codify this thing. I got to be looking at the same thing across all the teams. What's going on?
Yeah. And that's where you start to get into trouble. Like, let's compare this team to that team, and like, all sorts of bad things. So Tristan, I'm gonna turn to you now, and we were sort of joking about Jira at the beginning of the podcast before we kind of got rolling. A podcast, live stream, I don't know, what is this? So the question I have for you is, like, you've clearly had some experiences that shape your thinking around this too. And before we even talk about Mapkeep and kind of the careful work that you've been doing with that, I'm curious what you've experienced, like what Barbara's describing, elsewhere in the world around methodologies and tools. Jira seems like a place to start, but what do you think?
Yeah, there's a reason I brought it up. It's kind of ubiquitous, right? Where the tool becomes the methodology. But I have nothing really to contrast Barbara's points. Just again, provide more examples.
She's
right?
Usually right.
So something I've definitely, there was an interesting anecdote that I've experienced where I came to a large organization and Jira was too complicated. And I was aware enough of Jira just being a tool for a process, and I wanted a specific process. I think it took me 6 to 8 months to get approval to add a new workflow to actually get it done inside the tool. So I've fought that battle inside an organization and succeeded but it takes a long time to do.
Mm.
My framing for tools that y'all have hinted at is comes from a framing of communication protocols. So I'm a techie, so I think of things like HTTP, for example, for the web. It's a communication protocol, and you can do a lot of things over the communication protocol, but in the end, it's constraining.
Mm-hmm.
So tooling in my mind enable scaling something.
Mm.
It's that balance between exploration and exploitation. And when we start introducing tooling, we start shifting towards the exploitation part. And you can still do exploration, but this is what we're talking about. The tools are constraining and governing constraints. It's the governance, the exploitation of what happens. So the other thing I've seen Jira do is introduce people to things like Kanban that they've never heard about before. And so I've seen the benefit of it being as an education medium of coming across and haven't seen that done before. And I have not consulted at many organizations, so I have a less broader scope. But everywhere I've come in, I've seen people use things differently, and so by jumping between organizations, been able to extract lessons about how people do things differently and efficiently. And everybody does it differently, which is fascinating.
That's a really interesting point, and I think it's one that we could explore a little bit. And also, Barbara, I put a link to the Mira board that Tristan and I are playing in the chat too, so you can jump in here if you'd like. But basically, like what I'm hearing is there's kind of like a it's so difficult to describe this, but let's just say that there's a methodology, and that methodology is a body of knowledge, which isn't quite right, but like in Simon Wardley's typology of components, let's just call, I guess, is it a practice? How we do things? Yeah, I guess so. I always get it confused. There's ontology, epistemology, methodology, and I guess it's wibbly. Let's say the combination of the practice and the knowledge is this methodology, right? And what we've built on top of it is social practices, I guess. Like, if I were to teach someone Wardley mapping, like it's not gonna look like, here, read this PDF and watch this video and you're done. It's like, that would be a very like scale up kind of way of doing it, and we're not quite there yet. Instead, it's more like a social thing. It's like, hey, why don't you and I sit down and make a map together? Like, yeah, we can do that. So like social mapping, I guess, if that's like, or social method, social practice of the method. And then a tool comes along and says, wow, this stuff is so cool, we want to add this to our organization. And so then someone writes software. And like, software form of methodology. And like, this becomes kind of the first moment of calcification, because unlike a social practice, which can be wibbly and fluid and move around and it can adapt to context and so on, once you write code and you deploy code, it has a certain stickiness to it. And yes, if like you have a lot of like energy to spend around updating and revising and improving and adapting and all that fun stuff as you bring in new information, like, sure, you could certainly make the software form more flexible to adapt to different contexts. But in general, like, that's the moment of commitment. Like change is going to be really, really hard, and I think it's because of the like really scale up moments are when you're trying to make things the same. So it's premature, maybe. Well, let me throw that out there. What about software implementations of methodology is guaranteed to be premature?
So part of my framing, how can I draw? I think this is how I can draw. Yay. I can draw. Thinking about my framing on this has been through the Kinevan lens.
Mm-hmm.
right? So we have our Kinevin, and we have our, what is this? This is gonna be some complicated. Thank you. Oh wow. Yeah, I'll just let you put complicated
I'm
there.
here to
Thanks,
support you,
appreciate it.
man.
So yeah, so we have a clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And so again, I've mentioned framing before, where let me see if the tooling colors. Okay, here's the thickness, here's the colors. Got it. Okay, slowly learning. So I've been through thinking where everything, the complex and chaotic, is sort of exploration, and complicated and clear is exploitation on the right. So that's sort of my mental frame for this. And so when you're talking about when something is premature, is if we are not ready to start exploiting, if we haven't figured out enough, and we are still optimizing for the cost of change. So a parallel to this would be kind of Genesis and custom built early on in the Wardley's evolutionary axis. And so if we're still optimizing for cost of change, then building software is hazardous.
Yeah.
Hazardous in the sense that we are increasing our cost of change, right? On the other hand, if we are ready to relegate something and start thinking of it as complicated or clear, then it starts making sense to build tooling and software. That's sort of my framing on it, and I'm very much from the take the perspective that which Kinevin domain you treat something as is very much a choice. I'm gonna pull up a slide. Give me a minute to kind of illustrate it better, but
Yeah.
that's what I have for now.
That makes sense to me so far. Barbara, what are your first reactions here?
Well, first of all, we need Jabe to talk to us about socio-technical systems right now.
Yep, it's true.
Super disappointed that he's not here.
Oh, bummer.
But I agree that it is on the ordered side of the Kinevin framework that we make money. I mean, when we're on the unordered side, then it's difficult to exploit. That doesn't mean that enterprising souls are not going to try.
Right.
And one of the problems with certain tools is that they are sold as all-in-one solutions, all-encompassing answers, and that's where things get a little tricky, because there are, Tristan, if we're going to talk about the Kinevin framework with this, right? Like it is, you do have to have some sense of where you are when you're trying to map things, right? Am I working with an ordered problem, or am I on the unordered, either complex or chaotic side? And because that will affect how you map, what's going on and what's mappable, right? Because there's, once you're into the domain of unknown unknowns, then there's stuff that's not going to make it onto the map.
Yep.
And so, the idea that, and what I always fear about tools is that, is this idea that it becomes a sort of one and done situation, right? We bought this, we acquired this, and therefore that's all we have to do. Whereas, as we know, Wardley mapping is a practice, it's an intellectual exercise, and it's really difficult on an intellectual and cognitive level. And one of the problems with tools is that they make it look easy.
Yeah. Yep. I have, this reminds me of some discussions I've had with Jabe around like platforms in particular. And one of the things we talk about with the platforms is that if you say for example, you've got a bunch of developers and the company is like, hey, the developers are like ordering computers all the time, and it's taking like 3-4 weeks to get them, and oftentimes they're not right because Ops is like trying to hand configure them or whatever. Let's build a platform so they can self-service. Well, if you oversimplify the engagement with the very real problems of scarcity that are not having infinite disk space, not having infinite compute, not having infinite network, if you hide all that from the developers, then they won't be exposed to the consequences of their actions when they click the button and get another machine. And so like this reminds me very much of what you're saying, where it's like, how can we create like I think Jabe would call it like frictionful experience with the thing. And I think there's something similar here with tools. Like, how can we enable developers to experience just enough friction so they can be mindful about how they use the thing? In that platform example, for us, how can we enable users to have a just frictionful enough experience with the methodology that forces them to engage more deeply with it than the facile sort of very simplistic interpretation of a thing? Because like Tristan pointed out, like it's great that I can go to Jira and like be exposed to Kanban for the first time. That's fabulous. But if I get exposed to it in a way that enables me to stop thinking versus a way that enables me to think about the right things more carefully and maybe not think about the things that are like just toil, I think you can run into trouble pretty easily there. So Tristan, it looks like you've got a slide up here, and oh, I see SLOs. Hello. You have my attention.
So this came out of a presentation I gave a while back. It has SLOs because it was an SRE presentation, so you have to put those in there.
Yeah.
But this comes from a framing. I'm sure there's some other name. I call it economy of thought.
Okay.
So what? Because everything y'all just said about being aware, paying attention, etc. I come from a point of view where I can only pay attention to so many things, and while there's a lot of it, I also have limits, and that is informed from just developing software. There is so much to understand, and if I choose to understand everything, it is possible, but it is time consuming, and then we go into the exploration time trade-off. Now, bounded condition, there you go. That's a shorter phrase to describe all that.
I stole it from Jabe. I'll be the Jabe proxy.
And so what I found helpful framing was that I can choose where to engage my cognition, right? Like I can choose the things that I want to really focus on.
Yep.
And then I can hopefully spend less time thinking about other things that I'm relying on, but they're not my area of expertise. One area where I'm very familiar where this comes up is in large organizations when you have teams building software. And this is where the framing of APIs and SLOs comes from. Now, what can happen is everybody on the team, it has to deal with the complexity of whatever service they are providing. So the world inside their service looks complex to them. And that, I mean, Kinevan complex. So they are tightly in a tight feedback loop with the environment, and they understand everything there is to understand about their area of expertise.
Yep.
And a way to scale that is by providing some sort of a complicated shell that other people can interact with.
Yes. Okay.
So to me, that's what APIs and SLOs are. They're this complicated shell so that people on this other team over here, they are dealing with their own internal complexity, and they can only afford to spend enough cognition to absorb something complicated, something stable that doesn't change. They don't have to be in a constant feedback loop with, and vice versa, right? The yellow team over here would like a complicated interface to all the complexity that the orange team is handling. So it's sort of this mutual distributed network, and a complicated interface, API, SLO, and this is what I alluded to earlier, as a communication protocol, where it allows us to bound our cognition to not have to spend it on things that we choose not to. Yep. And if it's a deliberate process, to Barbara's point of being aware of our decisions, if it's a deliberate process, then this works well. If it's we get in trouble when this becomes automatic and we forget that there is complexity on the other side of this complicated facade.
Yep. And I think that's where you can very quickly get yourself in trouble. But to very briefly channel a little bit more Jabe, like what you're describing with having limited time, attention, resources, energy, etc. Like on the one hand, I kind of almost think that's like a version of what strategy is. Like where are you going to put the precious time, attention, resources, etc. of your organization? But when you look within the boundaries of your organization, you start to realize that, hey, there's a lot of moving parts in here, and not everyone can understand everything. Like one lesson to take away from The Blind Man and the Elephant, which is from a paper called The Elephant and the Uremia. I'll try to find the link to the citation for you all later. Rene Guzlas is the artist, in case you didn't know. One way to view that is that like we're missing all the parts, and therefore we can't experience the elephant. The other way to view this, and I think this is like building on some of the things Jay Bloom has said and John Allspaw has said, and I think a couple other people too, is that the elephant is really flippin' big. And everyone here is not interested in a holistic view of the elephant because literally it's too big to hold in your head as a whole thing. And so it's good for you to know that the whole thing exists. But how could you allow, for example, the trunk experts to do their thing and the tusk experts to do their thing and the people who focus on elephant butts to do their thing? Like, how could you enable an organization that has a variety of expertise and skills and interests to still work together as a coherent whole? And I think the in-betweens is where it's really interesting. Jay does a lot of like weird in-between things, talks about like stuff that gets stuck between boundaries in organization is like, it's like crust. Ugh. But like organizations definitely have that problem. And I like the fact that in order to interact meaningfully with others, you kind of have to hide some of the mess, but you don't want to hide too much of the mess. And so to bring this full circle, Barbara, I think if we were to frame the method problem as one not of preventing people from building tools for things, because clearly they're going to build tools anyway, Tristan, and good tools at that. What could we do instead to suggest how we could create friction in the right places in the tool so that people know that there's a deeper there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because a lot depends. Because I'm a consultant, I use that word all the time.
You're allowed.
I know a lot depends on, the purpose to which the organization is putting this tool, right? Like, and what level of the organization is this tool being structured for? So when I'm on the team level with Tristan and the guys or the girls or the peoples, I understand this distinction between what's complicated, what's within the boundaries of my understanding, what's outside the boundaries of my understanding. When I'm 2 or 3 levels up from that level, then I'm like, who gives me the most understandable thing? Who gives me the prettiest map, or the map that makes the most sense to me, or the Jira board that makes it look good, or the colors are nice. There's a level on which the audience, and this goes back to some of the McLuhan stuff as well, it's often the audience for the work or for the output of the tool that determines the use of the tool.
Ooh, okay. Al, tell us about that audience. What's a likely story there?
I mean, when I'm doing a Wardley map with you or with, one of our other friends and things, or I'm even working through one for an organization I'm consulting for or something like that, um, the audience is usually myself or the other people that are involved in the project. If I have to kick it up two levels in the organization, it's a very different map.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I gotta oh yeah, no, you can't show them that. Oh, geez, don't say that. But and that's true of I mean, we've all been there where a manager has looked at a Jira board and gone, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
What are you people doing?
So you
it's
can
like,
drink directly from the fire hose, whereas there's a layer of, so one of the other things Jabe talks about is time spans, right? So like,
yeah,
one of the ways that might work here is a translation, and it's
yeah.
not about translating words so much as translating time spans. And literally, like, imagine that everyone can only hold 10 things in their heads at a time. Like, it's literally like, how do you take all these groups of 10 things and turn them into 10 things at a level higher? Like,
And if you're competing for the attention or the resources of that higher level, then it becomes that it adds a competitive level to the usage of the tool.
Okay. Yep. That makes sense. So what do we do about it?
Well, I mean, as I say, for me, it's often because I don't have a lot of skin in the game in any organization I'm in. I'm not trying to get promoted, or I'm just trying to get paid through the end of the engagement. There is often a place for me to say this kind of thing to people. To say,
Yep.
this is what you're doing, or at least allow them to figure that out. I sort of guide them on the process of figuring out well, the reason that Team X gets all the attention is that they produce a really slamming report every quarter, and and look at those charts. And so, there's that, but a lot of this, as I say, comes back to this idea of, and it's really like an intergenerational training thing, right? It's not the people who are figuring out how to use the tools in the organization for the first time. It's the people coming in after them.
Oh, yeah.
Where we're all figuring this Wardley mapping thing out now, right? Like, we're like, but, we're like, well, really, that's how you use that? But, if I'm in an organization and I figure a lot of this stuff out, when we get some new team members, I'm like, this is how we do this now.
Yep. Yeah. Huh.
And so there's that intergenerational aspect of this as well, which is that, and I've been in places where I've gone in and they're like, oh yeah, this is how we do Agile, and I'm like, really? Oh, okay. This is, and so, and you go along to get along if you're new to an organization, right? Like, if they tell you this is how we do things, or this is what this means, or this is how this tool is used, then that's what we do.
Yep.
And so, and then that becomes the way things are done. So a lot of this comes down to, as we initiate some of these things within an organization, what responsibility do we bear for this codification stratification problem?
Okay. And that brings me to another thing I've heard Jabe say before, because of course he has opinions about everything, mostly time and mostly design. But from the design standpoint, like, I mean, I've asked him like questions about like, hey, so like, it's in the design community, there's like this kind of fascination with what makes a good design, right? And on the one hand, there are, and I think Mike Montero has done some like, I'll say critique of this kind of positioning as well, but like, is the AK-47 rifle a good design because it's idiot proof and it's something that even a child could pick up and use, right? So it's like horrifying when you start realizing the full implications of a quote unquote usable design without consideration for the context in which it's going to be used. And there's this notion of designer responsibility, and to the extent that you produce a bad design and it escapes into the world and the consequences start to wreak havoc and so on. Like as a designer, like aren't you responsible for making sure that you try to do whatever you can to reduce that harm and to like release new designs that make fight like combat that harm or do something right to take responsibility for it. So I think taking responsibility is part of the game, but we're also like focused on the move fast break things like side of this as well, which is like, well, we've got nothing right now. And like if I write one line of very meaningful code that nobody uses, have I designed anything? Have I actually done anything worthwhile? And there's a tension there, and it's not either or, clearly.
But there's also that notion of like, and we're at kind of an inflection point with this in many ways, which is that, I consider myself a Wardley mapping dilettante. I'm
Excuse me, you're gonna make me look up words again. Dilettante. Is this French? Okay.
Yeah.
Whoa. Oh, that's a very judgmental word about yourself.
But I mean, as my mother would have said, I know enough to be dangerous. I'm not like really, and I'm not you. I'm not Simon
sure
or
I'm
Kat
you
or well, we all aspire to be you, Ben.
Multitudes.
Yeah.
We're all multitudes.
But I am always very careful when I talk about Wardley mapping because I am painfully aware of what I don't know. Or what I haven't worked through myself, or and as this methodology, and practice is more widespread, you're going to have more people coming to the fore who may not be as well versed in Wardley mapping as some of the people that are on this live cast. So there's that as well, which is that, I've, as the Kinevin thing is part of my day-to-day life. And I go into organizations and, once it was, on the front, when complexity was on the front page of the front cover of the Harvard Business Review, I went into a bunch of organizations and I was like, really? Okay. Because
excited.
But there's as movements, as communities gain momentum and gain more members, you find that there's more and more outliers taking it in directions that you may or may not have thought it should go. And Simon is very hands off, right? Like he's letting it go, he's letting it grow and evolve and figure, letting us sort of figure it out. I mean, he has the book and he has things, but he's not going to call you up and go, that's not what I meant.
I actually disagree.
You do?
The only reason that I disagree is because of some recent events, which I won't get into at this moment.
Okay.
Where there is a moment where like he's organized, I think, the community mostly with enabling constraints. But there are lines that can't be crossed.
Right.
And I think that if he were having to intervene constantly in setting the rules and saying, no, you can't do that, yes, you can do this, then that would be a problem from his standpoint. He definitely doesn't want to do that. But if something does happen where someone, for example, would violate the license or over some, if it doesn't seem like the truth will take care of it, I feel very confident that he would come in and slam the hammer on it.
Right.
But that's extremely exceptional, I think.
Right. And within individual organizations, none of us are policing individual organizations. So if someone sits in on this live stream and then goes away thinking, I know all about Wardley mapping now, which you do not. Not if you've been listening.
Teach me if you do.
Maybe Ben and possibly Tristan, but certainly not me. If they go back to their organization and are by default the Wardley mapping expert because they heard you speak about it, then that will inform how that organization develops their practice of mapping.
Definitely.
And the same applies to the tools in many ways, right? And you brought up an interesting point the last time we talked about this, which is tools that die, right? Like I use a tool, I'm still using it, but it hasn't necessarily kept up with the evolution of the practice.
Yep.
And now it's no longer supported, but we still have it, so we're going to keep using it, even though it's not really reflective of what Wardley mapping is anymore.
And with evolution, it's not just individual components that evolve, it's like entire sets of compositions of value chains. And sometimes you're stuck with that tool because of the composition that is surrounding it and stabilizing it from above and below, what depends on it and what it depends on. So it creates a stability that makes that hard to change.
But Tristan, I would like to hear what Tristan has to say about this, since he has actually built a tool.
Yeah, I'd like to actually get into, like, if we could describe kind of some of the work that you've been doing even lately, because I know since we talked last, you've made developments leaps and bounds, and maybe we could talk about some of the specifics, maybe around comments that you've been working on. So for everyone here, like, what's Mapkeep? Where can they find it? What is it? Like how does it work? And tell us about some of the features you've been building.
Okay. Yeah. So Mapkeep is a place for you to keep your maps. And so you can create maps and you can share them with others. So it's a hosted platform where you can host your maps for free with everybody. The reason I built it was based on the interaction that I had with other developers around GitHub. And I was wondering what a GitHub for Wardley maps would look like. In the previous conversation, we described it as having slow conversations around maps through comments and a conversation back and forth and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in sharing your Wardley map with the world and receive some feedback on it via comments, then mapkeep.com would be the place for it. As to, what are my comments on what I've heard so far? I think there's an interesting dichotomy where we started the conversation where the medium is the methodology, and we need to be able to not have the designer overwhelm people with constraints, becomes methodology. And we ended up through that talk at designers are responsible for not designing AK-47 to be too simple so that children can't use it, right? And so it's just like everything in the world, it depends. There was a very timely, very short Twitter exchange I had with Chris Daniels this morning, where he was inquiring about what it takes to make a good decision and how do we measure it. And I was reminded of, echoing some of what we're saying here, is through the framing of coherence of multiple scales. So, and what I'm trying to say here is, I guess this will be my pitch for good design, which is completely an amateurish pitch. So nobody take this seriously, please. The coherence across multiple timescales. So a tool needs to be able to do something well in the current moment to address a current need. And then it also needs to not get in the way of future development. And it needs to be able to support long-term evolution of the practice, etc. Right? So there's at least like 3 timescales that are in there. But then we also have context scales. And I've seen very few things that can interweave multiple contexts together. Just because I've seen a few doesn't mean there are few. It's just my exposure here. But what I mean by there is we have the context of the tool builder, we have the context of the tool users, we have the context of the mapping community, we have the context of people experimenting with maps and moving the practices forward. And so the harder part there is, how do we interleave all those different contextual scales together in a coherent way so that things don't start blocking each other out, so that we maintain maximal optionality at all of these scales. And so that's sort of after thinking about this is sort of the disposition that I'm arriving at, is as a tool builder, is to be able to maximize optionality at all different scales, which will include trade-offs. But back to our designer is responsible not for not getting in the way, but also for safety. And that in the end, the tool builders will shape the world in their image through the action. And it's not, the technology is not, aside from human endeavors, we put our marks on it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've made a lot of work for you, Tristan. Like,
yep.
You're going to be on this tool now, and it's just going to be like, oh, I've got to do that now, and more optionality, but less constraint, more optionality. Oh, yeah, it's the balancing act, and I admire you for taking this on, because it is like a really hard problem. And we humans are tricky, and we will do anything to try to make something like something else, make it look, make it easy. And the job of designers and developers who build these platforms is to not necessarily counteract that, because that's where some of our best innovations come from. I would never have thought of using that like that. Wow.
Right.
But we have to be cognizant of the potential for abuse, right? I mean, when I hear social media platform developers say, well, we couldn't have expected that people would use it like this. And it's like, we have been doing this kind of stuff since we slithered out of the primordial ooze, and figured out how to pick up a stick and hit somebody with it. So, there is that notion that, and I one of the things I really get from you is that you're not approaching this with a really utopian vision, right? That your tool will, provide the answers or solve the problems. You're building a tool, and we'll see how it works in the wild. Is that correct? I hope I'm not.
That's correct. I'm very much. This was Mark Burgess from the Promise Theory fame. My favorite saying that I'm blanking out on. Dynamics trumps semantics, and the way I interpret that is what exists, the artifacts in the world, is more important than what they mean, because meaning is so flexible. And so as building Mapkeep, I'm really focusing on, I'm building the artifacts, and I'm trying not to imbue them with some meaning that I hope people will get. As to your point around designing social things, that's part of the reason why comment system, the initial start of the comment system took a while, because once the comment existed, the other context that was very relevant and needed to be there was, how does somebody turn off a comment? How does somebody delete it? Or how does somebody prevent somebody from communicating with them? Right. And that doesn't seem like a functional requirement, but it completely is in a socio-technical system of people will want to not talk to each other. Mm-hmm. So as much as I hope that people would want to interact, etc., those safety things need to be in place in order to make those interactions possible. So yeah, very much agree with you there.
Yeah, it seems like you've been doing a lot of work in that this sort of design and awareness moment of thinking about how things could play out, whose perspectives you're going to be dealing with, where the friction points might be, and looking at, like, I kind of just was playing with some of the concepts you were describing as you were going through the time scales versus the contextual scales. And I'm kind of curious if you could walk us through how you would think through something like that. So I heard you say, like, use 3 different time scales, and I missed the middle one. So there's like current moment, current needs, and then the opposite end of that was future needs. Could you help me fill in the blanks here real quick?
The future needs, what I was thinking there is just mapping evolving, right? Like what Simon says, somebody will make a better map. So the entire practice just morphing into something else. A sort of, we can think of it ecological time scale.
Got it. Okay.
The current moment is the immediate one. And then the middle one is the tool co-evolving with the needs of what people are doing in the immediate sense. And that's just the tool growing itself.
Got it.
So,
okay.
like increased functionality to as to what people need, that sort of thing.
Got it. Okay, so there's kind of like immediate, and then the medium scale of coevolution, and the longer scale of ecological kind of paradigmatic shifts could be in play there as well. Like it might not be mapping, it might be something else, right? That comes along, and especially because I've noticed there's some overlaps between methods that and interest areas that already exist out there in the world, and some of the things that mapping does, and like why would we need to replace one with the other? Why don't we just kind of like merge them together a little bit in the right ways and use what's already there? That makes sense. And then you have the different perspectives that you're taking into account. And so clearly, like you're maximizing optionality for these different contexts and these different timescales. You're also minimizing optionality for certain versions of these things as well, it seems. So for example, in the context of an abuser in a community, like you're almost doing kind of the opposite for them. Like if you were to take like a red team approach, or like a, I don't know, black hat approach, if you will. Is that how that's working? Because it's kind of what I heard you describe, but I'm not sure. I'm just curious about your thought process here and how this works.
So there's actually very little process in that one. There won't be much insight. We have the benefit of that our social media platforms are very close to commoditized now. So there are standard things we can do to protect people, and they're just required before certain things are enabled. So it's not even less about the discovery, but about scheduling of, as the new affordance comes in place, it needs to have new constraints put in place to make the system coherent in at least with the safety context.
Got it.
That so that you don't get spam from everybody, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if I look at kind of this like weird little value chain that I was playing with when I heard you describe, mappers need to have slow conversations through maps. And in order to do that, you need to share maps and you need to keep maps. And the sharing and the keeping can happen through this software tool. And inside that software tool is one of these components of like comments. And so it sounds like what you're describing is constraints of some kind on the comments. And like, so there's a dependency that you're creating that maybe like if you're more in the move fast, break things, break people paradigm of making software, a constraint that you're not necessarily building a relationship between comments and that constraint. And then there's like obviously the enabling kind of things, like the technology part, right? Like the underlying stuff that actually makes it possible. So from a value chain standpoint, you can almost do the same kind of like visualizing, like, oh, we're going to add this relationship here in order to constrain the behavior of this comment.
Well, I think one big constraint would be it's all constrained to specifically Wardley maps, right? Like right now we're using Mirror Tool, which is a way to make comments and interact, etc., online about anything. And that provides a broad scope. So when you're faced with Miro, you're like, what do I do?
Yep.
And so it's hopefully an enabling constraint, but we'll see. It's still an experiment, whether comments in the context just specific to mapping itself, whether they are sufficient enough to warrant a specific tool. That is actually an unknown, is whether that is enough of a conversation and discussion to be a separate thing, whether that's the right size, whether that's the correct domain, or whether something like Miro, where it's kind of everything, whether that's the appropriate thing. Because we might want to talk about a map, but maybe I want to drop in a slide, maybe I want to do some stickies, etc. And that's a different conversation than just about the map. So it's an experiment in that way to see if it's the right size or not.
I'm trying to find this thing that we wrote down about like accessible introductions to things. Like there's a Wardley map template in the Miro template library, and so people are running into it and being surprised. They're like, oh, there's a thing there. But also it's a bad template. I know because I built it. So I know the constraints that I went through that totally prematurely oversimplified the process of mapping for the sake of making it accessible. But that was like again, a kind of situation where like, hey, Kanban is in Jira, hey, mapping is in Miro, and yeah, I like the tension there about using a specific tool. So maybe like in our last 5 minutes, the three of us could play with Mapkeep a little bit, and maybe what I can do is just share a screen here, and I can be your driver, what have you, and you all can kind of maybe make a map with me. I'll share my screen so you can see what's going on. That way you can tell me what I'm doing wrong. So here's Mapkeep. And if I start a new repository and it's, medium is the method, I'm going to make it public. Oh, interesting. Already we're talking about your affordances. Any signed in mapper could comment on maps in the repository. No one can comment. Now, interesting. We're already seeing these constraints.
There's
pop
an
up.
obvious in between missing. I am aware of that.
But you made a choice here about that, and you've at least given the people who don't want to be bothered the option to say no thanks. Okay. So I'm gonna.
Yeah, the safety was the priority here.
And I'm very glad to hear that. So I'm gonna create a new map. And so part of what we were talking about before was kind of like the method itself being at the bottom, like the body of knowledge and so on. And let's say Wardley mapping is in stage 2-ish. And then we've got several tools actually that are doing mapping now. So like methodology specific tools, and these are enabled, like the methodology specific tools seem to be falling in line with this this idea of having long form conversations or like long time span conversations. I could be wrong on this so far. So let's start here. What have I gotten wrong around this view of things?
Well, there's also, I mean, long time span, there's the historical perspective of being able to kind of look through so one thing about mapping is we want to be able to learn from the past. So there is some sort of disposition towards having long-lived maps, or at least an archive of maps that we can go back to and reference to understand more about the gameplay. At the same time, there is also very short-term throwaway maps that nobody needs to stick around, that where we're just trying to organize our thoughts in the moment as well. And so certain tools will, so Miro, I think, is very good for in the moment specific building of a map, multiplayer interaction, that sort of thing. I don't know, I have not attempted to use Miro for the long-term type of thing. I think Mapkeep would be closer to more of a long-term continuity sort of setup.
So long time span things versus short time span things, conversations.
And then there's just the archival concept, like an archive of the thing.
You can tell I'm learning because I'm learning how everything works here for the first time. This is like one of the first maps I've made in Mapkeep too, so bear with me.
That is not at all stressful for me.
Stressful for
but
you.
This will be a great user interface research video.
In real time on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that this way. One thing I wanted to ask you, Tristan, while Ben is learning Mapkeep is this notion of a sort of, longer term Wardley mapping, because most of the people I know that have used Wardley mapping have used it more in the ephemeral sense, right? Like I do a map,
Yeah.
And so do you see a real growth in this idea of learning through the maps?
I do, but I've seen it in me. So I've done it at work where I have kept up maps for over months at least,
Mm.
where I was able to then communicate, here's where we were, here's where we're going, and here is how we can view it this entire context. So in a larger organization over multiple months, I used just Google Slides, and there was a slide, and then the next slide, then the next slide, and seeing that evolution of map does help to orient for history. You've mentioned before new people coming in. It's like
Mm-hmm.
everything at organizations is always path dependent, and
Mhm.
so I do find value for specific things, not obviously not all the things, but specific things where we do want to maintain uh, an easy way of how did we get here sort of thing. I find mapping valuable, and I've done it myself in the past over the course of multiple months.
Yeah, because I could see it being also like super helpful in like a gap analysis situation where you're looking at what the various possibilities of acquiring different skills, products and things like that in the course of the project, what impact they would have, and being able to look back and say, we chose that path, this is what happened, and we didn't choose this other path, and this is what we predicted might have happened.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect
Yeah,
sense.
okay, good. Yeah, sorry. Sometimes I say things and I think, I don't know about that.
Well, that's why you got to get it out.
I've done that. I've I have I've created multiple maps and showing different features.
Yeah.
So it definitely was well received. The audience didn't know about Wardley mapping. I had to do like a little mini tutorial. Here's what the space means. But they were afterwards. I got some feedback that's like, oh, this really helped organize the giant complexity of what we were doing, because there were quite divergent paths about how we're going to proceed with some technologies, and now there's an archive of like, here's the road that we took and here's the road that we didn't take, and going that the project I moved away from, so probably nobody maintains it, but there is a potential depending on the level of adoption of Wardley mapping in an org. It's very much akin to, in software development side, lots of design documents living for a long time. So a long-lived map is essentially the long-lived design document that justifies, that is another medium to show how did we get here and why did we do this.
Yeah. From the standpoint of the medium being the methodology, one of the things it seems you're pushing for is also the ease of changing and exploring, and being able to like just pick up this map and play with it and fork it and just go off and play. And I think it's an interesting tension between that and maps as code, for example, where like it feels pretty static, and yet it also completely depends on the perspective of the person doing the mapping, because software developers may view that as a very fluid thing. Code can be changed anytime. It's lovely. Whereas those of us who like point and clicky things, I'm definitely in that camp. Or actually, I like writing things even better. Need something that can be pointed and clicked at, I guess. Yeah.
And Mapkeep is definitely not there yet. It doesn't have all the interaction that you can do already with Miro, for example, that sort of thing. But the GitHub model, it's a clone of the GitHub model adopted to maps. So what's nice about the GitHub model is it's a place where you can clone somebody else's code and then add your changes to it. So that's sort of enables that back to the Kinevin complex, where you want to experiment with your own things, own approaches. And so the goal here will be to clone maps and be able to submit suggested changes back to the author. And that might be beneficial for some public maps, though probably not much of use for smaller domain maps, maybe within a team, etc. Just like code. There's some giant open source projects that lots of people contribute, and then there are personal projects that people just host so that others can take a look at them.
Fabulous.
Of course, now I'm panicking over map bullying.
Map
bullying. Oh yeah, That's
You know,
scary.
now I'm like, oh, what's going to happen? So yeah, I mean, but that's for me to take away with myself and worry about.
Well, I mean, if anyone really looked at my maps, I feel like they would they would realize how low the bar is. So Barbara, just to sort of close this out here, um, what are you thinking about now that we've had this discussion and exploration around, the ways that tools constrain or potentially enable the methodologies? Like they certainly make them more accessible, but then they embed an oversimplified version in there. And we talked about friction and things like that. What's the next thing you're worried about? What's kind of on your mind as a result of this conversation? Where should this head next?
Well, of course, map bullying is going to be, an obsession of mine for the foreseeable future now. But yeah, I'm also, because Tristan is clearly well versed in the Cynefin framework and the complexity model. And I'm always thinking of these things through the lens of complexity theory. And I do want to take this opportunity to invite both of you to come and talk to the New York City Complexity and Cynefin meetup about this very topic. I think that as an intro to Wardley mapping, using Mapkeep, it would be kind of pretty awesome.
Okay, I say yes. In July.
Yeah, I'm not. June is all booked up.
June's weird right now.
June's weird.
Happy to do it whenever Ben can.
Yes, and everything is dependent on my continuing to have broadband, which seems to be up in the air right now.
Oh dear.
But what I'm thinking about, I mean, I'm surprised I made it today. Yesterday was just I was like, well, maybe I should just text Ben and tell him no.
Well, I'm glad
but what
didn't.
I'm thinking about, I mean, for me, this is always takes the place in the broader context of tool usage in organizations. I mean, I should say that I am neither a developer nor a designer. I am by trade and a marketing consultant. And, if you ever want to talk about the abuse of tools, come talk to us on the marketing side. We can abuse anything. And so I'm always, but this has given me a really good insight. And I thank you for this, Tristan, into the mindset that goes into developing a tool in its sort of nascent stage, because I often stumble over these things after they're fully cooked. And, and people always ask me, what's your favorite tool for X? And I'm like, whatever you got, because I have to work within the confines of what the organization already is using. So I don't really have any quote unquote favorites of anything. So what I'm thinking about now in particular is creating those feedback loops on tools so that as they develop and as they emerge, how can we capture those emergent properties and create a feedback loop for the tool?
Yeah, and to borrow another word from Kat Swattel, conspicuousness. To make these things discussable is enormously important. So
yes.
With that, I want to thank you both for being here, and thank you also to all the fun people in the chat. I love everything that I'm seeing. I'm sorry I didn't get to respond to everything, but thank you for being here and for contributing to this discussion. And Tristan, Barbara, I hope we get to discuss this again soon, perhaps at the New York City Complexity Meetup. And Ben, thanks so much for having me, and also for providing these live streams, because I think they're an awesome tool for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. See you all later.